By the winter after Frank Miller walked off her land, people in Osage County would stop calling him the man who burned Kansas. Rebecca didn't know that yet. She only knew the wheat was standing past ready, and no man in 3 towns would take her wages. Halstead and Corbin among them. Corbin had come to the porch and said his back was troubling him. Halstead had not bothered with a reason. She had been the one to walk the West Quarter every morning at first light, the way Ellis had walked it before her, the way she had learned to walk it after he died, and she knew what she was looking at. The heads were heavy and beginning to shatter. Another week of dry weather would strip the field. Another rain would flatten it. There was a window, and the window was closing. She had gone into Osage on a Tuesday to make one more round of the boarding houses and had come home with nothing. Tyler was at the barn door when she rode up. 10 years old, thin the way boys get when they grow faster than they eat, with his father's eyes and a habit of not asking questions he already knew the answer to. He took the reins without a word. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table without taking her hat off and looked at the field through the window until the light started to go. That was the evening she said the name out loud to herself. Frank Miller. She had heard it the way everyone had heard it. A man who had ridden out of a town in Kansas the night it burned, and had never given an account of himself and had not tried to. A man who took work when he needed to and moved on when he did not and did not answer questions about the parts in between. There was a story mothers used to tell children about him, though nobody could quite say where they had first heard it. He was somewhere south of Osage that spring. Wintering, some said, on a claim nobody was working. She knew that because the boy who ran letters for the post had said it in passing 3 weeks earlier, and she had noted it the way a woman notes a thing she does not yet know she will need. She rode down the next morning before she could talk herself out of it. She found him behind a low sod house patching a wagon axle in the yard. He looked up when she came through the gate and did not stand. He was younger than she'd expected. Dark-haired, clean-shaven, with a mark along his jawline that could have been a burn or could have been a knife, and a kind of stillness she had seen in men who had learned to hold it deliberately. He waited for her to speak. She told him her name and what she had come for. The wheat was ready. The men wouldn't come. She could pay $2 a day and board in the barn. She said it all at once without softening any of it, the way a woman says a thing when she has stopped expecting anyone to take it well. He set the wrench down. How many acres? 82. He looked past her at the road for a while. When? Tomorrow if you can. He nodded once. She had expected him to name a higher number or to ask what other men had said or to ask why she had come to him in particular. He asked none of it. He wiped his hands on a rag and told her he'd ride up at first light. She rode home and did not tell Tyler where she had been. She told him only that a man was coming in the morning to help with the harvest, and Tyler looked at her the way he had learned to look when a thing did not sit right, and he did not yet know why, and then he went and drew the water for supper. That night she lay awake listening to the house settle and thought about what she had done. Toward morning she stopped thinking and only listened, and somewhere before the light came up she heard a horse coming up the road at a walk, unhurried, as if the rider knew exactly what he was riding toward and was in no particular hurry to arrive. He came up the track just as the eastern sky went from gray to the pale color that comes before real light. Rebecca was already at the pump. She had been at the pump 20 minutes doing nothing that needed doing, filling a bucket she had already filled once. She heard the horse and did not turn until it had stopped at the gate. He dismounted and led the animal through without asking. He took his hat off when he saw her, and that was the first surprise. She had not expected him to take his hat off. He did it the way a man does who was taught it young and had not seen a reason to stop. Mrs. Cade, Mr. Miller. He looked at the barn, at the house, at the long slope of the West Quarter running down toward the creek, and she watched him take it in the way a man takes in ground he means to work. Not the way the buyers looked at it, not the way Halstead had looked at it either. He looked at it the way Ellis used to look at it, which she had not expected and did not know what to do with. "I'll put the horse up," he said. "Where do you want me to start?" "West Quarter. The heads are shattering." He nodded and led the horse toward the barn. Tyler had come down off the porch and was standing at the edge of the yard watching him. Frank stopped when he saw the boy. He did not smile. He did not put his hand out. He looked at Tyler the way he had looked at the field, taking measure, and then he said, "Morning." Tyler said, "Morning," and did not move. Frank went on to the barn. They started that morning. She had thought she would need to explain the cradle scythe to him, and she did not. He set up in the west quarter with the sun still low and began to work, and by the time she brought coffee out an hour later, he had cut a swath cleaner than any hired man she had watched in 10 years. He took the cup without looking at her. He drank it standing. He set the cup on the fence post and picked the scythe back up. He did not talk. Not the way hired men talked, filling the day with weather and horses and complaints about the last man they had worked for. He answered when she asked something, and the answers were short and exact, and then he went back to the work. She had expected the silence to feel like a warning. It did not. It felt like the silence of a man who was doing what he had come to do and did not require an audience for it. By noon she brought bread and cold meat out to the field. He sat on an overturned crate at the edge of the cut swath and ate without hurrying. Tyler had come out with her and stood a few paces off, watching. Frank looked at him. "You know how to bind sheaves," Tyler nodded. "Come tomorrow then, you bind, I cut, your mother stacks. We'll be through this field in 4 days. Tyler looked at his mother. She nodded. He looked back at Frank and said, "Yes, sir." Frank went back to eating. That evening she brought him supper on a tin plate to the barn. He had already unrolled his bedding in the far stall and set his saddle on the rail and hung his coat on a peg. The lantern was lit and turned low. He took the plate and thanked her and set it on the crate he had pulled over for a table. She stood in the doorway a moment. "There's a room in the house," she said. "It's Ellis's old room. Nobody uses it. The barn's fine, ma'am. You'll be cold. I've been colder." She nodded and turned to go. At the doorway she stopped. "Mr. Miller." "Ma'am, thank you." He looked up from the plate. Something moved behind his eyes and then settled. "You haven't paid me yet, Mrs. Cade. Don't thank me till the wheat's in the wagon." She went back to the house. She did not sleep well. Somewhere past midnight she got up and went to the window and looked out toward the barn and saw the lantern was still lit, low and steady, and she could see the shape of him standing just inside the open door, looking out at the yard. He was not sleeping. He was watching. She stood at the window a long time. The second morning she was already awake when the rooster started. She heard him at the pump before the light came, the long clank of the handle in the cold, and she lay in bed listening to it and thought about what a person could tell from the sound of a man drawing water. Whether he was hurried, whether he was doing it because he wanted the water or because he wanted to be up. Ellis had drawn water like a man who resented every early morning of his life. Frank drew water like a man who had made peace with them a long time ago. She got up and dressed and went out to start the fire. They cut the west quarter the way he had said they would. He moved through the wheat with the scythe swinging low and even, and Tyler walked behind him binding the sheaves with a speed she had not known the boy possessed. She stacked. By the end of the second day, they had cut nearly a quarter of the field and her back ached in places she had forgotten she had. And she stood at the kitchen window that evening, watching the two of them walk up from the field together in the long light, Frank's hand resting briefly on Tyler's shoulder as they crossed the yard, and she had to sit down. She had not seen anyone touch the boy that way since Ellis died. That night after supper, after Frank had thanked her and taken his plate to the barn and Tyler had gone up to bed, she stood at the window again and watched the lantern come on in the barn doorway and the shape of him settle into the doorframe with his back against the post. He stayed there. She watched for a long time. He did not move except to shift once and pull his coat closer. He was watching the road. She went to bed. She woke at some hour past 2 to the sound of a dog barking a long way off, and she went to the window without knowing why, and the lantern was still lit and Frank was still in the doorway, and he had a rifle across his knees now that had not been there earlier. He was looking east down the road. The dog stopped barking. He sat another few minutes and then set the rifle down against the doorframe and stood and stretched and went back inside the barn, and the lantern went out. She sat at the window a while after that. She thought about the wheat. She thought about what a man watched for at 2 in the morning on a farm where nothing had happened. She thought about the way the men in town had refused her wages and about what a person could hear in a town if they were listening for it. She thought about the grain thieves everyone had been talking about since July, the ones who had hit the Peterson place and the 2 farms south of Council Grove and the mill outside Osage, and how nobody had caught them and nobody could say how they knew which farms to hit. She thought about a lot of things, and none of them added up in a shape she could name, and eventually she went back to bed and did not sleep. The third day Tyler came in from the pump at noon with a look on his face she recognized from when he was 6 and had seen something he was not sure he was allowed to have seen. "Mama." "What?" "Mr. Miller," she waited. "He was out behind the barn last night, late. I got up for water." "What was he doing?" Tyler was quiet a moment. "He was digging." She set the knife down on the board. "Digging. Not a big hole. Just he held his hands about a foot apart. He had something wrapped in cloth. He put it in the hole and covered it and stepped it down, and then he stood there a minute. Then he went back to the barn." She looked at her son. She looked out the window toward the field where Frank was working, his back to the house, the scythe going in the even rhythm it had gone in since the first morning. "Tyler." "Ma'am, don't say anything about it. Not to him. Not to anyone in town." "Not to anyone." "Yes, ma'am." He waited to see if she would say more. She did not. He went out to the yard, and after a minute she heard him drawing water at the pump, the sound of the handle steady and unhurried, the way Frank drew it. She stood at the board with the knife in her hand and did not move for a long while. She did not sleep that night either. She lay in bed with the window cracked open and listened to the house and to the yard beyond it, and somewhere past midnight she heard the barn door open, quiet, and the soft sound of boots crossing the yard toward the back of the barn. She got up and went to the window on the north side of the house that looked out over the small patch of ground between the barn and the pasture fence. The moon was 3/4 and she could see well enough. He was crouched at the base of the fence post, the second one from the corner, with a small spade in one hand. He worked without hurry. He lifted something from the ground, cloth-wrapped about the size of a folded shirt, and he held it a moment in both hands. He did not open it. He turned it once. The way a man turns a thing he is confirming is still what he left there, and then he set it back in the hole and covered it and pressed the earth down with the flat of the spade. He stood. He looked toward the road. He looked toward the house. She stepped back from the window before he could see her. She heard him cross the yard again and the barn door close, and then nothing for a long time, and then the low light of the lantern coming back on inside the barn, steady and small. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not know what she was looking at. A man who watched the road with a rifle at 2 in the morning and buried something at the fence post and dug it up again to check on it did not fit any of the shapes she had for him. He was not what the stories said he was. She had known that by the end of the first day. But he was something, and the something was hidden in the yard behind her barn, and her son had seen it, and she did not know what to do with any of it. She thought about asking him. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she thanked him and how he had said, "Don't thank me till the wheat's in the wagon," and she thought about the way he moved through the field, and she thought about what a woman gained by asking a question when she was not yet ready to hear the answer. She did not ask him. The next morning she made coffee and took a cup out to the barn before the light came. He was already up. He was standing at the workbench oiling the scythe. He took the coffee and thanked her. She stood in the doorway. "Mr. Miller." "Ma'am, there's a rider comes through Wednesdays with the mail if you want anything sent." He looked at her over the cup. She had not planned to say it. She had said it because she wanted to see what his face did when the subject of a letter came up, whether there was anyone he might write to, whether he had the shape of a man with people somewhere behind him or the shape of a man with none. "I've got no one to write to, Mrs. Cade." He said it without weight, not as a claim on her pity, just as a fact he was giving her because she had asked for one. "All right. Thank you, though." She nodded and went back to the house. They finished the west quarter that afternoon. Frank stood at the top of the slope with the last swath cut behind him and looked down at it, and Tyler came up beside him breathing hard, and Frank put his hand on the boy's head, briefly, the way a man does who is not accustomed to it, and is trying it out to see how it fits. Tyler grinned. Rebecca stood at the fence with a hand on the top rail and watched them and did not let her face do anything. That evening, a rider came up the road from the direction of Osage. She saw him from the porch. He was not anyone she recognized. He slowed at her gate and looked toward the house and toward the barn, and Frank came out of the barn at that moment with an armful of tack, and the rider saw him and did not stop. He kept riding. He looked back once when he thought he was far enough past. Frank set the tack down on the fence rail and watched the rider go until he was out of sight around the bend. Then he picked the tack up and carried it into the barn without saying anything. She went into Osage on Saturday for salt and coffee, and to post a letter to her sister in Emporia that she had been meaning to write for a month. She left Tyler at the farm. She did not leave him alone. She left him with Frank, and she thought about that on the ride in and did not know what to think about it, only that she had done it without hesitating, and that she would not have done it a week ago. Osage was busier than she'd expected for a Saturday in September. The mercantile had a wagon backed up to the loading side, and Mattingly was out front counting sacks with a stub of pencil, and he looked up when she came down off the seat, and his face did a thing she caught before he could hide it. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Mattingly." He set the pencil down. He came over to help her tie the horse the way he had never come over to help her tie the horse in 6 years of her coming into his store. "How's the harvest coming?" "It's coming. Heard you found a hand." She looked at him. "I did," he nodded. He was working up to something and she waited to see what it was. "There's been talk," he said. "There always is." "About the man you hired." She waited. "I'm not one to carry it, Mrs. Cade, you know that. But there's some who say, I know what some say. I heard it before I hired him. I'll thank you not to repeat it in front of my boy when he comes in with me next week." Mattingly's mouth closed. He nodded slowly. Something in his face rearranged itself, not into offense but into something more careful, and she understood in that moment that he had been about to warn her and had reconsidered on account of her tone and was now trying to decide whether to warn her anyway. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Mattingly, there was a rider through here Wednesday, asking about your place." She kept her face still. "What did he ask?" "How many acres, whether you had help, whether you were selling, and what did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't my business to say, thank you. He wasn't from around here. He rode south when he left." She looked at him a moment longer. "Did he give a name?" "No, ma'am, he didn't." She went inside and got the salt and the coffee and paid and posted her letter and walked out to the wagon without looking at anyone. And on the way home, she thought about the rider who had slowed at her gate on Tuesday evening and looked toward the barn, and about the rider Mattingly had described, and she wondered if they were the same man. She thought about Halstead. She thought about Corbin. She thought about who in the county knew that her wheat was ready, and her hands had refused her, and who might have wanted to know how long she would hold out before she sold. She thought about Ellis's brother in Kansas City, who had written her twice in the last year asking if she would consider what he called a fair price. And she thought about her neighbor to the east, Wendell Boyd, who had come by in July with a jar of preserves his wife had sent, and had stood on her porch talking about how a woman alone with a boy shouldn't have to carry a place this size, and how he'd be willing, at a friend's price, to take some of the acreage off her hands. She had thanked him for the preserves. She had not answered about the land. He had come back in August and asked again, and she had told him she was not selling, and he had smiled the smile of a man who had heard what she said and was choosing to hear something else, and she had watched him ride off with the feeling of a woman who has been marked without knowing yet for what. She came home in the late afternoon, and Frank was at the barn splitting stove wood and Tyler was stacking it, and the two of them looked up when she came into the yard, and Tyler waved and Frank nodded once, and she got down off the wagon and stood a moment before she went inside. That night after supper, she stood at the window and watched Frank take up his position in the barn doorway with the lantern low and the rifle across his knees, and she understood for the first time that he was not watching for something that might come. He was watching for something he knew was coming, and that he had known was coming before he ever rode up her track. They started the East Quarter on Monday. It was the smaller field, but the ground rolled more and the cutting went slower, and Frank set a rhythm that Tyler had to work harder to keep up with. She watched the boy stretch to meet it and not complain, and she saw Frank notice it too. And once when Tyler stumbled tying a sheaf, Frank slowed the swing of the scythe for the next dozen strokes without saying anything. And the boy caught up, and Frank picked the pace back up, and neither of them spoke about it. She had begun, that week, to notice things she had not let herself notice before. The way Frank set his coffee cup down on the fence post at the same spot every morning. The way he thanked her for supper without looking up and without making a performance of it. The way he had of standing at the barn door before he came out in the morning, half a beat, listening to the yard before he stepped into it. She had thought at first it was the caution of a man who had been shot at. She was no longer sure that was the whole of it. Tuesday night the dog barked again, not the neighbor's dog this time, a dog somewhere south, closer than the last time. She was at the window before she knew she had moved. Frank was already up. The lantern was low, but the rifle was across his knees and he was leaned forward, not slouched against the post the way he sometimes was, and she watched him the way she had watched him the first night. And this time she saw him raise a hand, and the shape of Tyler came out from the kitchen door in his nightshirt. She had not heard the boy get up. Frank did not turn his head. He waved Tyler back with the hand that was not on the rifle. Tyler stopped at the edge of the porch. He looked at Frank, and Frank looked at him for the space of 2 seconds, and something passed between them that Rebecca could not read, and then Tyler nodded once and went back inside. She heard the kitchen door close and the sound of his feet on the stairs. She waited until the dog stopped barking. It went on for another few minutes and then went quiet. Frank sat in the doorway another half hour without moving. Then he stood and walked out into the yard and looked south down the road for a long time and came back and sat down again. She went downstairs before the light and made coffee and took 2 cups out to the barn. He was still awake. He took the coffee and thanked her. "Mr. Miller." "Ma'am." "What was it last night?" He looked at her over the cup. He did not answer right away. She had the sense of a man choosing not between truth and a lie, but between 2 pieces of the truth, deciding which one she was ready to hold. "Riders," he said. "3 of them. They came up the south road as far as your neighbor's line and stopped, sat their horses a while, then they turned and went back." "Boyd's line?" "Yes." "Did they see you?" "They saw the lantern. That was the point of the lantern." She held her cup. "You wanted them to." "I wanted them to know somebody was watching the barn." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. He drank his coffee. He set the cup on the workbench. He picked up the scythe and started for the door. "Mr. Miller," he stopped. "Who are they?" He looked at her a long moment. His face did not change. But she saw the thing in his eyes she had seen twice before, the thing that had settled somewhere behind the stillness, and she saw him decide. "Mrs. Cade, I'll ask you to trust me another 2 weeks. After that I'll tell you the rest. If I tell you now, you'll do something with it, and what you'll do with it will get you and the boy killed. 2 weeks. The wheat will be in by then. Will you give me the 2 weeks?" She looked at him. She thought about the rider who had slowed at her gate. She thought about Wendell Boyd's smile on her porch in August. She thought about her son standing on the porch in his nightshirt and the hand Frank had raised without turning his head. 2 weeks, she said. "Thank you." He went out to the field. She stood in the barn with her coffee going cold and looked at the workbench where he had set his cup, and at the peg where his coat hung, and at the corner of the stall where his saddle sat with the bedroll rolled tight beside it. And she thought about what a woman had to have decided about a man before she gave him 2 weeks on nothing but his word. She had decided it. Somewhere between the first cup of coffee and this one, she had decided it, and she did not go back on decisions once she had made them. She went inside to start breakfast. The East Quarter came down on Thursday. They stood in the stubble at the end of the day and looked at what was cut and what was left, and Frank said they'd be through the whole crop by the middle of next week if the weather held. Tyler asked if that meant they could go into Osage on Saturday for the horse fair, and Frank looked at Rebecca, and Rebecca said maybe, and Tyler took maybe for a yes the way boys will and went off to unhitch the team grinning. Frank watched him go. "He's a good hand. He's my whole hand now. He'll be a better one than his father was, if you don't mind my saying." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the boy crossing the yard. How would you know what kind of hand his father was? He turned his head. He did not answer right away. Then he said, "I wouldn't. I meant the shape of him, the way he sets to a thing. That's yours, Mrs. Cade, not his father's." She did not know what to say to that. She looked out at the field. "We should get in," she said. "There's a storm coming." "Tomorrow night," he said. "Not before." "How do you know?" "The way the birds went east this afternoon. My father taught me. He was wrong about most things, but he was right about birds." She almost smiled. She caught it before it went anywhere, and she turned and started for the house. Friday came in still and hot, the kind of stillness that meant he was right. They cut hard through the morning and put the sheaves under canvas in the afternoon, and by the time the first wind came up out of the southwest, the field was covered and the barn doors were shut and the animals were in. The rain started at dusk. It came down heavy and stayed heavy for 6 hours, and Rebecca stood at the kitchen window watching the yard turn to mud and thought about the lantern in the barn doorway and whether Frank would keep it lit in a rain like this. He did. She could see it through the rain, small and steady, and she could just make out the shape of him standing back inside the doorway where the wet couldn't reach him, but still in the doorway, still watching the road. The rain would cover the sound of horses. The rain would cover a lot of things. She understood then that the lantern was not there because he thought riders might come. It was there because he had decided that on a night when riders would come, the light would be lit and visible and known, and any man who saw it would know a man was awake and armed inside the barn, and any man who did not know that already would learn it from the light itself. She went to bed near midnight. She did not sleep. Sometime past 3, she heard the rain slack off and then start again lighter, and she heard something else under it, and she was at the window before she was fully awake. A horse, coming up the track at a walk, one horse. She went down the stairs in her nightdress with a shawl thrown over and her feet bare, and she opened the kitchen door onto the porch and stopped. Frank was already in the yard. He had the rifle. He was standing between the porch and the gate, and he did not look at her, but he raised a hand behind him, low, palm down, and she stopped where she was. The horse came up to the gate. The rider was a man in a long oilskin coat with the hood up. He stopped at the gate and did not get down. "Miller." Frank did not answer. "Miller, it's Hollies." Frank lowered the rifle a degree. "Not all the way. Come up slow, hands where I can see them." The rider dismounted and walked his horse up to the porch. He pushed the hood back. He was a lean man of about 40 with a sparse beard and eyes that had been wet a long time. He looked at Frank. He looked past Frank at Rebecca on the porch. He looked back at Frank. "They're moving tomorrow night. Boyd's got them at the old McKinney place, 6 of them plus him." "How sure?" "Sure. I was in the loft. I heard the whole of it. He wants the wheat and the wagons both. He wants the woman off the land." Frank was quiet. The rain came down softly around them. "Ride back," Frank said. "Don't come here again till it's done. Tell Reeves I want 3 men at the creek crossing by sundown tomorrow and 2 at Boyd's North Gate and himself at the McKinney place with me." "Yes, sir." Hollies got on his horse. He looked once more at Rebecca. He touched the brim of his hat under the hood and turned the horse and rode back down the track. Frank stood in the yard until the sound of the horse was gone. Then he lowered the rifle the rest of the way and turned and looked up at the porch. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Miller, I think it's time I told you the rest." She lit the lamp and set it on the kitchen table and put water on for coffee she did not want because she needed something to do with her hands. He took his coat off at the door and shook the rain out of it and hung it on the peg and set the rifle in the corner where he could reach it. He sat down at the table. She sat down across from him. The lamp was between them and the light on his face was low and even, and she saw for the first time the tired underneath everything else in him, the tired he had been carrying since before he ever rode up her track. "My name is Frank Miller. That part is true. I was born in Missouri. My father was a blacksmith and my mother taught school. I have not burned a town in Kansas or anywhere else, Mrs. Cade. I want you to know that first." "All right. I'm a Deputy United States Marshal. I have been for 11 years. I work out of the district court at Fort Smith under Judge Parker, though for the last 2 years I've been on detached assignment to the territorial office in Topeka." She held her cup. She did not drink from it. She waited. "There's a ring of men working the grain counties. They've hit 14 farms across 3 counties in the last 18 months. They don't rob the farms outright. They break the men who own them. They spread rumors, they run off hands, they cut fences, they poison a well if a man won't sell. Then they come around, one of them, always the same one, with an offer at a friend's price. When the man sells, they move on. When he won't sell, they burn what he's got, and they let him go under and they buy it off the bank. Boyd. Boyd is the one who makes the offers. He's not the head of it. He's the face of it in this county. There are 3 other men in 3 other counties doing the same thing. The head of it is a man named Ashland who runs a freight company out of Kansas City. He takes the wheat down the river and sells it at scale and splits the money with the men who bring it to him. How long have you known? About Boyd, since June, about Ashland, since last spring, and about my farm." He looked at her. "Your farm was on the list, Mrs. Cade. It was the next one. I've had a man in Boyd's crew for 4 months, Holly's, the one who rode up tonight. He got word to me in April that your name was on a page Boyd keeps in a strongbox in his cellar. There are 7 names on it. Yours was the 3rd. Who was first? Peterson. They hit him in May. He sold in July." She set the cup down. "So the stories about you, the burning, Kansas. I started those in Topeka 4 years ago on a different case. I found they were useful. Men who might have talked to a marshal wouldn't talk to me, but they'd talk near me because they thought I was one of them. Men who would have run from a marshal came to me because they thought I might be for hire. I kept the stories going. I have never contradicted them and I have never confirmed them. They do their own work now. And when I came to hire you, I was 2 days from riding up here to offer you my services under another name. You came to me first. That was better. It meant nobody in Osage could say Boyd had cause to suspect I'd come looking. A widow hires a hand. That's a common enough story." She looked at him a long moment. "The bundle, behind the fence post. My badge, my warrants, my commission papers. If Boyd's men had come at me while I slept, I did not want those things found on me in the barn. I moved them each night in case one of the boys who works the Mercantile Road had followed a rumor here and thought there might be something to steal. I checked on them because a man who buries a thing and never looks at it forgets where he put it. Tyler saw you. I know. He told me. I know that too." She looked at him. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside, the rain was coming down soft, and even in somewhere in the barn one of the horses shifted in its stall. Tomorrow night, Reeves and 4 other men and me. We'll take them at the McKinney place before they can move on you. Boyd will be there. When we take him, we take the strongbox with the list and the ledgers of what he's paid Ashland. It'll be enough to hang him and enough to send federal men after Ashland in Kansas City. That's the whole of it, Mrs. Cade. And after," he looked down at his hands on the table, "after I turn in the badge to Reeves and I ride out or I don't. That part I have not decided." She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and she did not sleep, and near dawn she heard him moving in the barn and she got up and put on the coffee and did not go out to him because she did not know what she would say. Tyler came down at first light and looked at her face and did not ask. "Tyler, ma'am, you're going to your aunt's in Emporia today, on the noon coach. I'll send word ahead." "Mama, you're going, Tyler." He looked at her. He looked out the window toward the barn. "Is he going to be here when I come back?" She held the coffee pot. She did not answer for a long moment. "I don't know," he nodded once. He went upstairs to pack. She drove him into Osage herself and put him on the coach at noon with a letter for her sister and money for the fare, and she watched the coach until it was small on the eastern road, and then she turned the wagon and drove home the long way, the way that went past the old McKinney place. She did not stop. She did not slow. She looked at the sagging roof and the fallen barn and the pasture grown up in horsemen, and she drove past it and on toward home, and she thought about a man sitting in a doorway with a lantern for 6 weeks so that other men would know he was watching. Frank was at the yard gate when she came up the track. He took the horse. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Miller, the boy get off all right?" "He did." He nodded. He led the horse into the barn. She went into the house. The afternoon was long. She cleaned things that were already clean. She stood at the window twice and made herself sit back down. She could see him in the yard checking his rifle, and then his sidearm, and then his rifle again. And once she saw him unpin something from the inside of his coat and turn it in the light and pin it back, and she understood he had dug the badge up for the last time. At 5 o'clock, Hollies came up the track with 3 other men. They dismounted at the barn and Frank came out to meet them, and they stood in the yard talking low. And one of them was older and heavier than the others, and she knew without being told that this was Reeves. Reeves looked toward the house once. Frank shook his head at whatever Reeves had said, and Reeves nodded and did not look again. They rode out at sundown. 5 men, 4 horses walking out the south road toward the McKinney place and Frank on the 5th, and she stood on the porch and watched them go, and she did not raise her hand and Frank did not turn in the saddle. He knew she was there. That was enough. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp unlit, and the rifle Ellis had kept over the mantel across her knees, and she waited. She heard the shots at some hour she could not have named. 3 of them close together, far off to the south, and then a scatter of others, and then one more alone, and then nothing. She sat and waited and did not move. She did not know how long it was before she heard the horses coming up the track. She was at the door before she had decided to stand up. 4 horses. She counted them in the dark. 4, and one of them carrying 2 men, one slumped against the other, and she felt her stomach turn to water, and then the lead rider came into the yard light, and it was Frank. He got down. "Mrs. Cade, Mr. Miller, it's done. We have Boyd. We lost one of Reeves's men. Reeves took a ball in the shoulder, but he'll keep it. You. Not a scratch on me, ma'am." She stood on the porch with the rifle in her hand, and she did not know she had it until he looked at it. She set it down against the porch rail. "Come inside," she said. "All of you." They came inside. She heated what was on the stove and made more coffee, and Reeves sat at her table with his shoulder bandaged with a shirt one of the men had given up, and the wounded man was laid out on the settle by the fire and would be all right, and Frank stood by the door with his hat in his hands and did not sit down. Reeves talked. He talked about Boyd's cellar and the strongbox and the 7 names on the list and the ledgers going back to 81 and the men Ashland had in 3 states, and he ate what she put in front of him, and he thanked her, and he stood and he told his men to mount up. "Miller, sir." "The badge." Frank crossed the room. He took the badge from inside his coat and set it on the table in front of Reeves. Reeves picked it up. He looked at it. He looked at Frank. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Reeves closed his hand around the badge and put it in his pocket. He stood. "Mrs. Cade, Marshall, your country owes you a debt it will not know it owes you. I'm sorry for that." "It owes me nothing, Marshall. It owes him." Reeves looked at Frank. He almost smiled. He did not. He touched the brim of his hat to her and went out to his horse. They rode out. The 4 of them and Boyd tied across a saddle among them, and the yard was quiet again, and Frank stood at the door with his hat in his hands, and she stood by the table, and neither of them said anything for a long time. He was the first to speak. "I'll go to the barn tonight, Mrs. Cade. In the morning I'll ride out or I won't. You should sleep on it. So should I, Frank." He stopped at the door. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him hear it. He did not turn all the way. He turned enough. "There's no decision for me to sleep on," she said. "There's one for you. I've made mine." He stood in the doorway a moment. Then he set his hat on the peg. He did not put his coat on it. He hung the coat over the back of the chair, and he crossed the room, and he sat down at the table across from her. And she poured him coffee he did not drink. And they sat there without saying anything more for a long time. And outside the yard was quiet, and the wind had gone down, and somewhere a whippoorwill started up in the cottonwoods along the creek. She stood up eventually and went to bed. He went out to the barn. In the morning he was at the pump before the light. She heard the handle, and she lay in bed a moment listening to it, and then she got up and dressed and went down to start the fire. Tyler came home on the Wednesday coach. He got down and saw Frank at the wagon waiting for him, and he did not run. He walked, the way a boy walks who has decided he is old enough not to run, and Frank set his hand on the boy's shoulder and took his bag and lifted it into the wagon, and Tyler climbed up on the seat between them and rode home in the middle without saying much. And every so often he looked at Frank, and then at his mother, and then back at the road. And by the time they reached the yard, he was grinning the way he used to grin before Ellis died. The wheat went to market the second week of October. It brought top price. Rebecca signed the receipts in her own name and put the money in the box under the floorboard in her bedroom, and she and Frank sat at the kitchen table that evening and worked out what would go to seed and what would go to the roof and what would go to the new fence line on the east quarter, and they worked it out the way two people work out a thing that will belong to both of them. Word about Boyd went through Osage County the way word always goes, some of it right and some of it wrong. Halstead came out to the farm in November with his hat in his hand and asked whether there might be work in the spring, and Rebecca told him she'd let him know. Corbin never came. Mattingly at the Mercantile started saving her the good coffee without being asked, and once when a stranger in the store made a remark about the man Rebecca Cade had married, Mattingly set down what he was holding and told the stranger he could take his business to Emporia, and the stranger left, and Mattingly went back to counting nails. They married in the small church in Osage the first week of December. Reeves came up from Fort Smith to stand for Frank. Rebecca's sister came from Emporia. Tyler stood between them at the front of the room, and the expression on his face was the one he had been wearing since October, the one of a boy who had understood something before the adults had gotten around to saying it. Frank never spoke about the years before Osage, not to strangers and not much to Rebecca, and never to Tyler. He put the badge away, and he put the stories away with it. In town, people who had once crossed the street to avoid him began to nod to him, and then to speak to him, and by the second year, men were coming out to the farm to ask his advice on things they would not have asked another man about, and he gave what he had to give and did not make a show of it. On a Tuesday morning in April, 3 springs after the harvest that had almost been lost, Rebecca came out to the porch with a cloth-wrapped bundle for the mercantile order. Tyler was on the steps pulling on his boots. He was 14 now and taller than she was, and he took the bundle without looking at it and stood and headed for the wagon. Behind the house she could hear Frank at the pump, the long, steady clank of the handle, water coming up cold from the ground. She went inside and started the morning. And that was the story of Rebecca Cade and her son Tyler, and of the man everyone in 3 counties had learned to fear, who rode up her track on a Tuesday morning and stood in her barn doorway with a lantern lit against the dark, and watched the road for the men who were coming, and did not tell her his name until the wheat was in. If you enjoyed this one, let me know in the comments. Thank you.